Ouais?
J'ai besoin que tu rappliques.
On veut juste savoir ce qui s'est passé dans la jungle. Où sont-ils?
C'était le meilleur interrogateur que j'ai jamais vu.
Vous croyez tout savoir, hein? Vous n'avez même pas commencé à gratter le vernis. Les apparences sont parfois trompeuses.
Jusqu'où êtes-vous prêt à aller?
Je ne dirai rien d'autre.
The fact that that it takes place in the military is kind of incidental. 50 years ago, you would have done this in an English drawing room. The events that happen are the only thing that the military has to do with it is that you need to be able to imagine a group of people who all have guns in order to make this. To make the events plausible, it has to be in a circumstance where everybody's armed. But that's about all it has to do with the military. It's funny. There is a tendency in some of these military thrillers to express one's disapproval of the policy that the military have been used for by denigrating the people in the military themselves. There was a certain amount of that. That's probably the largest change I made in the script, was that like in General's Daughter, and there are a couple of since then, people very often, I don't know, they make movies where they sneer at the people in the military as if they're all somehow bloodthirsty, stupid, corrupt, mean. And they do it, I assume, largely out of a political sympathy or a political desire to discredit the uses, the policy uses, the decisions that the government makes about the military. And I don't know, personally, I kind of think those are two different things. That it's one thing to disagree with the policy, but it's something else to make shit of people who happen to be in the institution. And very often it's the people doing this are not of the class who would ever be part of the military. So there's a whole class warfare, if you will, where there's a sort of sneering at the lower classes is involved in this. Because the people who go in the military are lower middle class, and they go there because they can get, because it is, in the United States at least, it is one of the major routes into the middle class. It is a way for poor people to not be poor anymore and become middle class. They go into the military, they get an education, they learn personal habits that allow them to structure a middle class life. And I have for quite a while found, this isn't the first time, but I've found it offensive that people who were usually from privileged upper middle class literate backgrounds would express their political opinions by making shit of the institutions that are very good for lower middle class people. I mean, the Army isn't given the credit for it, but they're largely responsible for even the Civil Rights Movement. It's the closest thing to a race-blind institution in the United States. I don't know about in Europe. give them another 10 years, it'll be the closest thing to a gender-blind institution. And it's not a damned accident. You can read things that Teddy Roosevelt and the other progressives of the turn of the last century, people who wanted to eliminate class in America, as part of their strategies, they had two major things. One, universal public education. Make them all go to the same school, and you break up class barriers. And the other thing was put them all in the Army. Put them all in the same Army, make them wear the same uniforms, sleep next to each other, and you will destroy class barriers. They thought about this in 1905 and didn't really get a chance to do it until the 1940s, but the enormous changes that happened in the United States about breaking down class barriers and creating a nation mostly of middle-class people, which was the essence of the 1950s and 60s. It was a middle-class nation entirely, with one exception. The blacks were still left out. But that middle-class fluorescence came out, was created by the experience of all those people going into the Army in World War II. And the way that the Army had a lot to do with fostering the, or somehow sponsoring the civil rights movement. I don't mean to minimize the sacrifices of the people who actually did the civil rights movement, but what the military had to do with it is somehow they convinced the rest of white America that the people running the civil rights movement were right, you know, so that by the time Martin Luther King was on the television talking, most Americans already agreed with him. They already thought he was right. And that came from the experience of the universal military service in the 1940s. Because if the same thing had happened in the 1930s, most Americans wouldn't have agreed. They wouldn't have agreed. And what's going on now is, you know, it's a giant laboratory that they're figuring out how to put genders together and eliminate gender barriers. And they're having all the difficulties and problems of it, but it's astonishing watching. You know, you watch the news from Iraq and you see all these women in the middle of everything. And that's new. That wouldn't have even happened 10 years ago. I'm sorry, I really have gone off on this, but I do vehemently think they're two different things. You can disagree with, be very angry, loathe the decision to invade Iraq, but I don't think that means you should make shit of the people who were in the Army.